4 years ago, China experienced its most severe air disaster in nearly 30 years. China Eastern Airlines flight MU5735 plunged almost vertically from a cruising altitude of 8,900 meters straight into the mountains of Guangxi. All 132 people on board perished. Over the past 4 years, the Chinese Communist Party's investigation results have shifted from being described as extremely complex to not being allowed to be made public, and finally to being withheld on the grounds of endangering national security. It wasn't until 2 days ago that the US National Transportation Safety Board revealed a batch of analysis reports totaling 261 pages. Within these reports lies the truth about the final 90 seconds before the China Eastern plane crashed. The truth is about to come to light. Today, in just 25 minutes, we will take you through this highly watched incident and help you clearly understand what exactly happened on that plane back then and what information the United States has disclosed. What has the Chinese Communist Party concealed over these 4 years? Let's turn back time to the afternoon of March 21st, 2022. At Kunming Changshui Airport in Yunnan, China, flight MU5735 was preparing to fly from Kunming to Guangzhou. There were 123 passengers and 9 crew members on board, a total of 132 people. Among them was a young wife who had just registered her marriage with her boyfriend and was traveling across the country to reunite with him in Guangzhou, as well as college students returning to school after their holidays. There were also grassroots workers shuttling between 2 cities, 132 souls striving for a better life in their ordinary days, all longing to return home. They boarded this flight, but never made it to their destination. The plane was a Boeing 737-800, less than 7 years old and in excellent condition. The captain, Yang Hongda, was a 32-year-old young man with over 6,700 flight hours. His father was also a captain, making him a typical second-generation pilot. The co-pilot was Zhang Zhenping, 59 years old, with nearly 32,000 flight hours. That level of experience is no small feat. I'll talk more about it later. There was also an observer, Ni Gongtao, 26 years old, with only 556 flight hours, who was on duty for training. At 1:16 p.m., the plane took off on time, climbed, turned, and reached its cruising altitude of 8,900 meters. Everything was going smoothly. Communication between the ground control tower and the pilots was perfectly normal, with nothing unusual at all. But then, 64 minutes after takeoff, at 2:43 p.m., the calm was shattered. The plane suddenly began to descend, not a gradual descent, but almost a vertical plunge straight down. According to ground radar data, the plane at nearly a 90-degree angle plunged from an altitude of 8,900 meters and crashed into the mountains of Teng County, Wuzhou, Guangxi in just over a minute. According to data from Flight Trader 24, at that time the plane's maximum descent rate exceeded 9,800 meters per minute, which means it was descending at over 300 meters per second, the equivalent of dropping from the height of a 100-story building. When it hit the ground, its speed exceeded 1,100 kilometers per hour, slower than a bullet, but still enough to smash a several dozen-ton airplane into tens of thousands of pieces and to gouge a 20-meter-deep crater into the mountain. But what's strange is that throughout the entire process, the plane did not send out any distress signal. In that minute or so, what exactly happened inside the aircraft? After the accident, the Civil Aviation Administration of China set up an investigation team, and CCTV began 24-hour rolling coverage. Rescue personnel trekked over mountains and through forests, searching more than 400,000 square meters of woodland and collected over 49,000 pieces of debris. On the 3rd day after the accident, the first black box, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, was found. 4 days later, the second black box, the flight data recorder, FDR, was dug out from a depth of 5 feet underground. Both black boxes were severely damaged. According to international practice, since the aircraft was manufactured in the United States, the black boxes were sent to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. The NTSB laboratory, with assistance from the United States, helped decode the black boxes. This ended up planting a huge, unexpected seed for what would happen 4 years later. A major foreshadowing. Over the following 4 years, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, CAAC, repeatedly reported on this crash. On April 20th, 2022, exactly 1 month after the accident, the CIC released a preliminary investigation report systematically ruling out almost all external causes. There was nothing wrong with the aircraft, nothing wrong with the crew, nothing wrong with the weather, and nothing wrong with air traffic control. Further details were still being analysed from the black boxes, and the investigation continued. A month later, on May 17, 2022, the Wall Street Journal, citing sources familiar with the matter from the US side, revealed that according to the flight data recorder, the plane had deliberately nosedived in response to commands from someone in the cockpit. In other words, the plane crash was a deliberate act. Friends, pay attention to this detail. This information was released in May 2022 and was based on sources familiar with the matter in the United States. So how did the United States come to this conclusion, and how did the US even know about this information? This is related to a batch of recently released classified documents that we will talk about later. Friends, keep listening. As soon as this information was made public, the Civil Aviation Administration of China immediately refuted it, saying that it was a serious misguidance of the public and an interference with the accident investigation. However, when the Chinese side refuted it, they only said that the public's claims were incorrect, but did not provide any evidence to counter it. They didn't say, for example, that our data shows it wasn't intentional. You see, anyone familiar with this can immediately tell the difference between these two types of rebuttals. In March 2023, on the first anniversary of the accident, the Civil Aviation Administration of China released a progress report on the investigation, but the report contained almost no new substantive information. It was filled with vague and empty adjectives like very complicated and extremely rare. More importantly, in the same report, they cited Article 34 of the Regulations on the Technical Investigation of Civil Aircraft Incidents, which prohibits the public disclosure of black box data information. This is essentially saying that whether or not we found anything, we can't tell you anyway. In March 2024, on the second anniversary of the accident, there was yet another report with no real content. Then, in 2025, something truly astonishing happened. A Chinese netizen formally applied for information disclosure under the Government Information Disclosure Regulations. They requested the Civil Aviation Administration to release the progress and results of the MU5735 accident investigation. The official response was, "Disclosing the information you requested may endanger national security and social stability." 132 people died, yet the truth is said to endanger national security. Friends, take a moment to really think about that. Suppose, as they claim, there were no external causes and the crash wasn't due to outside factors. Then it could only be the pilot's responsibility. But wouldn't that make it even easier for the CCP to shift the blame and clear itself? So why don't they shift the blame? That can only mean that there's something behind the truth that they simply can't shake off. What could that be? I'll mention later that this March marked the 4th anniversary of the accident, and for the second year in a row, the Civil Aviation Administration has not released an annual update on the investigation's progress. This is a blatant violation of the International Civil Aviation Convention. According to this convention, if the country leading the investigation cannot produce a final report within 12 months, it must publicly release an interim statement every year on the anniversary of the accident. In other words, the CCP hasn't even fulfilled this most basic obligation, so we've been waiting for 4 years now. From claiming the investigation is too complicated to saying it cannot be made public, and then to citing threats to national security. So what exactly is the truth? The truth lies in the hard drives of the US National Transportation Safety Board. This January, a Chinese citizen living in the United States submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the NTSB, seeking the release of records related to the investigation of MU5735. This organization is called the NTSB. Friends, please take note, as we will mention this agency frequently later on. Its core responsibility is to serve as the chief investigator in the field of transportation. According to the US Freedom of Information Act, as long as the request does not involve national security, ongoing investigations, or privacy exemptions, government agencies must respond within a reasonable period. The NTSB reviewed the request for several months. According to their internal regulations, records of foreign investigations in which the US side has assisted are, in principle, no longer restricted by the rule that only the investigating country can issue the final report after 2 years have passed. So, in response to this request, they decided to make Part A public. On April 30th, the NTSB sent a reply along with the documents to the applicant, and the files were quickly uploaded to GitHub, where people around the world began downloading them. I read through this batch of documents, and there are 3 key pieces of information. The first key point is that the black box data was not nearly as badly damaged as the Chinese Communist Party claimed. For the past 4 years, the CCP has insisted that the black box was severely damaged and that the data was difficult to recover. But the NTSB report clearly states in black and white that the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, was ultimately successfully restored. The audio quality was rated as excellent, which is the highest rating given by the NTSB. This means that during the final moments of the flight, all conversations, sounds, and alarms in the cockpit were preserved clearly and completely. So why hasn't it been made public? Because all of the audio files have already been handed over to the Civil Aviation Administration of China. The NTSB did not keep a copy for themselves. This is in accordance with international conventions. They are an assisting party, so the original data belongs to the investigating authority. In other words, everything that happened in the cockpit during those final minutes on the plane, the conversations, what was shouted, what was said, what was cursed, what happened, was all completely recorded and is in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. They've had it for nearly 4 years because back in 2022, the NTSB handed over this segment of audio to the Civil Aviation Administration of China. But they have not revealed a single word of it to the public. As for the other crucial black box, the flight data recorder FD2, apart from one chip called U2 that was completely destroyed, meaning that data is lost forever, the engineers at the NTSB successfully retrieved data from the remaining 5 chips. They managed to restore the final 12 minutes of complete flight data before the accident, including the aircraft's attitude at the time, its speed, altitude, the positions of various control surfaces, the force applied to the control stick, engine RPM, and so on, altogether about 150 flight parameters. The data is accurate down to every single second, so when the CCP claimed it was severely damaged and difficult to extract, they were lying to you for 4 years. The second key point, and also the most important information revealed by this batch of documents, is directly related to the truth behind the plane crash. Let me explain this part in the simplest terms, so please listen carefully, friends. First, imagine a scene. The plane is cruising normally. According to the design of modern passenger aircraft, during cruising, the autopilot is on and the pilot's hands, well, maybe they're holding a cup of coffee or just resting on their laps. In this situation, there are several switches that absolutely must not be touched. The most critical of these is the engine fuel switch. This switch is only used before takeoff while the plane is still on the ground, and again after landing. The only other time it would be used is in an extreme situation, such as if the engine suddenly catches fire during flight. Its design also includes a safety mechanism, which means you must first lift a safety latch before you can push it down to activate it. This makes it unlikely for the switch to be accidentally triggered. However, even with such an important engine fuel switch, according to the flight data recorder, 23 seconds before the recording stopped, the fuel switches for both engines were flipped almost simultaneously. Both were switched to the cutoff position at the same time. 3 seconds later, the control stick was pushed downward and the control wheel, that is the yoke, also began to turn sharply. The plane started to dive and rolled to the left, making nearly a 180-degree turn. To put it simply, the aircraft was almost completely flipped upside down. Friends, just imagine you're sitting on a commercial airliner, the plane is cruising normally, you're eating peanuts and drinking water, and all of a sudden, the entire plane flips upside down, with the nose pointing straight at the ground in a dive. How terrifying would that scene be? The next 10 or so seconds are also the most heart-wrenching moment. In the report, there is a mechanical force curve chart that records the forces applied to both control columns. On Boeing aircraft, the 2 control columns are mechanically linked, which means that the captain and the first officer each push the column in front of them, but ultimately the forces are combined into one. This chart shows that opposing forces appeared simultaneously on both control columns. One was being pushed down with all its might, while the other was being pulled up desperately. The curve for the control wheel angle also shows a brief reversal and rise. In other words, the plane was pulled up for a moment but was quickly forced back down. This makes it very clear. During those 10 or so seconds, there were 2 people in the cockpit, fighting for their lives. One person was desperately trying to crash the plane, while the other was doing everything possible to pull the plane back from the brink of death. But he did not succeed. 20 seconds later, the flight data recorder, FDR, stopped recording because the fuel supply was cut off, the engines shut down, and the generator lost power. The recorder had no backup battery, so when the power was cut, it stopped working. At this point, the plane had already descended from 29,000 feet to 26,000 feet. The rest of the dive was not recorded by the FDR due to the power outage, but the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, which has an independent battery, continued to capture the sounds inside the cockpit, right up until the moment the plane hit the ground. However, the CVR recording is in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. The last key point is found in the 478 pages of documents withheld by the United States. In the NTSB's reply, they also revealed a crucial piece of information. They found a total of 2,818 pages of documents related to MU5735. This time, 261 pages of core black box data were made public, along with some email correspondence. However, another 478 pages of deliberation materials prior to decision-making were withheld and not released. Why is that? According to the spirit of the Chicago Convention, assisting parties in an investigation should not draw unilateral conclusions before the leading party releases the final report. In other words, the US side's conclusions can only be made public after the CCP issues the final report. But that might never happen. Friends, what do you think about this issue? If you think so too, leave a comment and let me know. And these 478 pages are the most important. According to industry insiders' speculation, it's very likely that the American experts' qualitative analysis of this disaster is the cause of the China Eastern MU5735 crash. The real reason. Up to this point, let me compare the doubts from 4 years ago with the data released by the US side yesterday. Was the plane really brought down by mechanical failure? The flight recorder shows that all 150 parameters were functioning normally, and the engine shutdown was caused by the fuel switch being turned to the cutoff position. So, mechanical failure can be ruled out as the cause of the crash. Could it have been due to weather or air traffic control? At the time, the plane was cruising at high altitude under clear skies, and the nearest thunderstorm was several hundred kilometers away, so weather can also be ruled out. As for air traffic control, could it have been caused by external interference, such as a hijacking? During the more than 60 minutes of the flight, there were no abnormal emergency code broadcasts from the cockpit, nor were any sounds of struggle picked up by the cabin crew's microphone outside the cockpit. Furthermore, the fuel switches are located on the central control panel inside the cockpit, so without entering the cockpit, outsiders simply cannot access them. If a perpetrator had entered the cockpit, how could there not have been even a trace of sound picked up by the microphones inside the cabin? So the possibility of a hijacking is extremely low. Then could it have been a case of the pilots making a mistake and accidentally flipping the wrong switch due to a lapse in awareness? For both fuel switches to be toggled at the same time, it would require someone to consciously operate them with both hands, or to use the same hand to perform a series of actions in quick succession. Coupled with the throttle and significant rolling maneuvers that occurred just 3 seconds later, this sequence of actions could not have been an operational error. That leaves only one remaining possibility. So the next question to ask is, in the cockpit at that moment, was it the captain pushing the control column while the first officer tried to pull the plane up, or was it the first officer pushing the control column? Was the captain trying to save the plane? This brings us to the 3 people in the cockpit. The main suspect is First Officer Zhang Zhenping. Zhang Zhenping was born in 1963 in Anning, Yunnan. In 1979, when he was in his first year of high school, he heard that a nearby gliding school was recruiting students, so he signed up, thus beginning his lifelong journey of soaring through the skies. In 1985, he joined the newly established Yunnan Provincial Airlines, which later became the predecessor of China Eastern Airlines' Yunnan branch. Later on, he was selected to go to Seattle, USA, to attend training at Boeing headquarters, becoming one of the first Chinese pilots to operate the modern Boeing 737 commercial jet. In 2011, Zhang Zhenping received the Civil Aviation Administration's Meritorious Pilot Medal. This medal is not something just anyone can earn. According to the regulations, you must have flown safely for more than 26,000 hours, and the time spent as captain must not be less than half of that in order to be eligible for such a medal. That same year, he became one of China Eastern Airlines' first group of 5-star captains. He has trained over 100 apprentices in the industry and is regarded as a true founding master. In 2018, the China Civil Aviation Network even published a special article telling his story. But on the afternoon of the China Eastern Airlines crash, he was sitting in the co-pilot's seat. On his left was a young man whose technical skills and experience were far inferior to his own. This scene was highly unusual because according to the rules of Chinese civil aviation, with Zhang Zhenping's qualifications and at the age of 59, he should normally be an instructor captain, examiner, or duty manager. That means no longer personally flying high-intensity flights, but instead mentoring newcomers, overseeing technical standards, and providing command and supervision. This is a sign of respect, as well as a way to care for the health of veteran pilots. At his age, still flying, and only as a co-pilot at that, is not normal. A senior pilot who once worked in China's aviation system said that such a situation usually only happens if someone has made a serious technical error and been disciplined. In other words, he was being given a hard time, and it's worth noting that there was already a strong atmosphere of this within China Eastern Airlines. There was a lot of resistance. In 2002, when Yunnan Airlines was merged into China Eastern Airlines, China Eastern promised that benefits would not decrease. However, after the merger, the pilots at the Yunnan branch saw their benefits drop from the highest in the country to below average. The Yunnan branch had always been profitable, but its profits were siphoned off by headquarters to subsidize losses elsewhere. Some pilots wanted to switch jobs, but in 2005, the Civil Aviation Administration stipulated that switching jobs required paying an exorbitant compensation fee. Zheng Hongji, a pilot from China Eastern's Yunnan branch, was once sued for 12.57 million yuan in compensation for changing jobs. The pent-up conflicts erupted in 2008 in what became the nationally shocking collective return incident. 21 flights from China Eastern's Yunnan branch had their pilots collectively use weather issues as an excuse to turn back in protest. This resulted in over 1,000 passengers being stranded at the airport. Afterwards, China Eastern finally admitted that the pilots were dissatisfied with their working conditions. And this was exactly the environment Zhang Shengping found himself in during his career. As a senior in the industry and a decorated pilot himself, could he really remain indifferent to the company's long-standing exploitation? Despite his illustrious career, he appeared on this flight as the co-pilot. This mismatch in professional status precisely reflects his true situation under suppression. Ironically, the captain on the left had logged only a fraction of his flight hours, barely more than his age, just a fraction of his own. So the most straightforward speculation in the industry is that the one who tried his best to pull the yoke back and save the plane was the young captain, while the one who shut down the engine and forcefully pushed the yoke down was Zhang Zhen. If that's the case, then why hasn't the CCP released the truth sooner? After all, they obtained the information back in 2022. Earlier, we mentioned that an American insider revealed to the Wall Street Journal that someone in the cockpit acted deliberately. How did this information come about? Because in 2022, the US had already handed over the report we are now seeing to the Civil Aviation Administration of China. But the CCP has not disclosed any of this to the public. Why is that? Let's look at an almost identical case and you'll understand. On March 24, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525, carrying 150 people, was flying over the Alps when the plane suddenly deviated from its course and began to descend, eventually crashing into a mountain with all on board perishing. Because the incident happened in France, the French Civil Aviation Accident Investigation Bureau launched an investigation that very day. 3 days later, they found the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and quickly completed the analysis. 6 days after the crash, they announced the results. The co-pilot had locked the cockpit door after the captain left to use the restroom and deliberately set the plane to descend in a dive. They concluded that crashing into the Alps was a deliberate act. A little over a month later, France released a preliminary report, and within a year, a complete report was published. Afterwards, France submitted more than 10 safety improvement recommendations to the international community. Soon, the entire international civil aviation industry began implementing reforms. The European Aviation Safety Agency then issued new regulations requiring that there must never be only one person left in the cockpit at any time. If the captain leaves to use the restroom, a flight attendant must enter the cockpit to accompany the remaining pilot. In addition, a mandatory psychological health screening mechanism for pilots was introduced. This is what a responsible government does. But the Chinese Communist Party, even after obtaining the complete flight data and voice recordings from the crashed plane, concealed them for 4 years. What are they afraid of? There are many things they are afraid of. Just think about it in reverse and you'll know. Could they do what France did? Once the authorities confirm it was intentional human action, then for the 132 families who lost loved ones, it's not just the individual pilot who will be held accountable. Instead, it would involve years of exploitation by China Eastern Airlines, personnel management issues within the company, regulatory failures by the Civil Aviation Administration of China, and even internal governance problems throughout the entire Chinese civil aviation system. This would lead to a series of major issues, possibly involving compensation on the scale of billions. A sweeping overhaul of the entire system, just think how many people's interests would be affected by that. So, it's better to let it remain a secret forever. That's the lowest cost and safest approach for them. Just wait for people to forget. But there will always be people who remember, and that's exactly why we're discussing this topic today. Think about the Yu Menglong incident before. After everyone persisted in seeking the truth for 2 whole months, the truth really did come to light, bit by bit. So regarding the China Eastern Airlines incident, we also hope that we can continue to apply pressure and seek out the truth, so that those families who have been waiting for 4 years can finally get the explanation they deserve. All right, that's all for today's discussion. Friends, what do you have to say about the truth of this matter? Do you agree or disagree with this version of speculation? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts with me. Lastly, if you enjoy my program, don't forget to give me a like. Also, please share my show with your friends and family, and don't forget to share your opinions in the comment section. Every interaction from you helps my videos reach a wider audience and is a great encouragement to me. So I kindly ask everyone for this small favor. All right, let's wrap up here for today. I wish everyone a happy weekend. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow on Debate Perspectives. Don't miss it. See you then. Bye-bye.